My name is Anita Benefor, and today I will be speaking to you guys about critical race theory. What is critical race theory, also known as CRT? According to Britannia Online, critical race theory is an intellectual movement and a framework of legal analysis according to which 1. Race is a culturally invented category used to oppress people of color, and 2. The law and legal institutions in the U.S. are inherently racist, insofar as they function to create and maintain social, political, and economic equalities between white and non-white people. So how did it come to be? Critical race theory was developed in the 1970s as an effort by activists and legal scholars to understand why the U.S. civil rights movement had lost its momentum and was in danger of being reversed. Their approach emphasized general and systemic features of the legal system that served to perpetuate race-based oppression and white privilege. So some examples of this was Black people were not allowed to purchase property, or if they were, they made it very difficult for them to actually attain that goal. Why is CRT so important? Critical race theory is important because it potentially provides a more realistic understanding of white racism in the U.S. as not merely a set of negative attitudes towards other racial groups, but also a body of law and legal practices whose real-world effect is the oppression of people of color, especially African Americans. It also allows for people to see the other side of American history, which oftentimes gets untold or swept under the rug, especially from the white lens. So the fact that Black people are teaching this, it actually gives a more realistic, authentic viewpoint of what actually happened in the US. Some interesting facts about CRT. Fox News has mentioned critical race theory 1,300 times in less than 4 months this year. Why? Because critical race theory has become a new boogeyman for people who are unwilling to acknowledge America's racist history and how it impacts the present day. Opponents fear that CRT admonishes all white people for being oppressors while classifying all Black people as hopelessly oppressed victims. These fears have spurred into school boards and state legislatures from Tennessee to Idaho to ban teachings about racism in the classroom. There's a fundamental problem here. These narratives about CRT are gross exaggerations of the theoretical framework. The broad brush that is being applied to CRT is puzzling to academics, including some of the scholars who coined and advanced the framework. So just to be clear, CRT does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or even into an entire group of people. They simply want people to understand that CRT states the U.S. social institutions, so the criminal justice system, the education system, the labor market, the housing market, and the healthcare system are laced with racism and are embedded through the laws, regulations, and rules and procedures that lead to differential treatment of Black people and people of color by white people in power. So white panic and the dismissal of racism. Sociologists and other scholars have long noted that racism can exist without races. However, and it can exist through the institutions, the social institutions, so the school board, healthcare system, housing market, etc., like I had just mentioned. However, many Americans are not able to separate their individual identity as an American from the social institutions that govern us. These people perceive themselves as the system. It's crazy, right? Consequently, they interpret calling social institutions racist as calling them racist personally. It speaks to how normative racial ideology is to the American identity and that some people just cannot separate the two. There are also people who may recognize America's racist past but have bought into the false narrative that the U.S. is now an equitable democracy. They are simply unwilling to remove the blind spot obscuring the fact that America is still not great for everybody. So although Trump pushed that narrative that make America great, it's not great. And it hasn't been great for people of color for a very long time. How does CRT challenge the neutrality of the laws in the US? Critical race theorists argue that the laws that explicitly impose a neutral standard with respect to race are capable of addressing only the most egregious forms of race-based oppression, and often only limited practical benefits for disadvantaged minority groups, affording them equality of treatment or opportunity, but not equality of results. So here are some positive critiques about CRT. It gives space for Black people to share their side of racist American history from their lens instead of a white lens. It promotes higher rates of youth participation in activism, politics, and overall the pursuit of higher education. CRT has also influenced scholarships in fields outside the confines of legal studies, including women and gender studies, education, American studies, and sociology. CRT has also spin off movements formed by the Asian Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ, Muslims, and Native American scholars who have also taken hold. In addition to these issues mentioned above, CRT scholars have also addressed themselves to hate speech, hate crimes, affirmative action, immigration, and voting rights. So there are some positives. There are actually a lot of positives, but the news as of recently has not been highlighting that. Here are some negative critiques about CRT. Various aspects of CRT have been criticized by legal scholars and jurists from across the political spectrum. Many critiques have faulted CRT for its apparent embrace of incoherent, postmodernist-inspired skepticism of objectivity and truth, as evidenced in applications of the voice of color thesis and discussions in the CRT literature. Opponents also argue that CRT is a racist and anti-white ideology/movement. Critical race theorists have also been charged with unfairly treating any external criticism of their approach, however well-meaning, as evidence of racism. Others have also accused critical race theorists of undervaluing the traditional liberal ideals of neutrality, equality, and fairness in the law and legal procedures, and of unreasonably spurning the notion of objective standards of merit in academia and in public and private employment. Instead, interpreting any racial inequality or imbalance in legal, academic, or economic outcomes as proof of institutional racism and as grounds for directly imposing racially equitable outcomes in those realms. So, to put it in short, white people are scared. They don't want the truth to be told from the lens of a Black person. They feel like teaching these types of things to children in schools promotes hate speech, promotes racism, and essentially blames all white people for things their ancestors did in the past. They also feel like speaking out on racism or America's racist past is not necessary and it isn't necessarily the truth, which is very interesting. The way things are, I guess, when people of color speak their truth, why it's questioned. So, why are some states banning the teaching of CRT in their school curriculum? In Texas, the new legislation, House Bill 3979, vaguely states that teachers cannot require or make any part of a course certain race-related concepts, including the idea that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, or that an individual is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive based on their own race or sex. The bill also states that teachers cannot be compelled to discuss current events or widely debated, currently controversial issues of public policy or social affairs. Like, I don't even understand that. Why not? However, if they must, they are required to explore such issues from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. So this is essentially a law that backs up America's racist history. We cannot speak about the things that happened to people of color from their lens. It has to be spoken about in a way that uplifts white people, or whiteness, I should say. However, critical race theory is not actually even taught in K-12 education, so that's elementary school and high school. It is instead typically reserved for law school and graduate school studies. Vida Robertson, director of the University of Houston's Downtown Center for Critical Race Studies, said the legislation was intentionally constructed to cause uncertainty among teachers for how it should be interpreted. It was intended for parents, for legislators to make accusations against people who are offering historical facts or perspectives that made them uncomfortable. So again, they don't want the truth to be told from a different lens because it scares them and they personalize what the colonizers or their colonizers did to people of color. So again, CRT is not blaming all white people for racism. It is speaking on the fact that the social structures in society uphold the racism and affect and oppress Black people to this day. The approach of some Republican-led state legislators is a method for continuing to roll Black racial progress regarding everything from voting rights to police reform. This is a horrible idea and does an injustice to our kids. Laws forbidding any teacher or lesson from mentioning race, racism, and even gender and sexism would put a chilling effect on what educators are willing to discuss in the classroom and provide cover for those who are not comfortable hearing or telling the truth about history and state of race relationships in the US. Ironically, making laws outlining critical race theory confirms the point that racism is embedded in the society, in the law.
Why are so many states opposed to CRT? To better understand how widespread these efforts are to ban critical race theory from U.S. classrooms, there was an assessment done on anti-CR legislation through states, and this is what they found. 8 states, Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, Arizona, and South Carolina, ironically all in the South, which typically is racist, have passed this legislation. None of the state bills that have passed have even actually mentioned the words critical race theory explicitly, except for Idaho. The legislations mostly ban the discussion, training, and/or orientation of the U.S. is inherently racist, as well as any other discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. These parameters also extend beyond race to include gender lecture and discussions. What happened to free speech? Or freedom? Yes, freedom of speech. State actors in Montana and South Dakota have denounced teaching concepts associated with CRT. The state school boards in Florida, Georgia, Utah, and Oklahoma introduced new guidelines barring CRT-related discussions. Local school boards in Georgia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia have also criticized CRT. Nearly 20 additional states have also introduced or plan to introduce a similar legislation. College professor Victor Ray speaks on his experience with this. Some parents are worried about their kids learning things in school that they do not have the capacity to address. As a college professor who does teach CRT as one of the main theoretical frameworks that I bring into the classroom, students are actually alarmed at how little they have learned about inequality. They are upset at their schools, teachers, and even their parents. So this is the conundrum. Teachers in K-12 schools are not actually teaching CRT, but teachers are trying to respond to students asking them why people are protesting and why Black people are more likely to be killed by the police. Very interesting. So to clarify the main message about critical race theory, scholars and activists who discuss CRT are not arguing that white people living now are to blame for what white people did in the past. They are saying white people living now have a moral responsibility to do something about how racism still impacts all of our lives today. Policies attempting to suffocate this much-needed national conversation are an obstacle to the pursuit of an equitable democracy here in America. Supporters of CRT bans often quote Martin Luther King Jr.'s proclamation that individuals should be viewed by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin, ignoring the context of the quote and the true meaning behind it. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I just have some questions for you to think about. What are your final thoughts on critical race theory? Do you believe it is harmful and is spreading hate amongst non-white and white groups of people? Do you believe it's rewriting history? Why or why not? Do you think it's important to be taught? And if so, why now? Last question. What do you think of Texas's House Bill 3979? Is it just another way for white supremacy to uphold its power over people of color through policy and speech? You let me know. Thank you.